They really lost their minds over there.
A series of large-scale strikes are hitting Russia. The world's largest gas processing plant is under attack. Several thermal power plants in the Moscow region were blown up by the ISU. There are massive blackouts there.
That's intense. Listen, what exactly did they bomb over there? Come on, tell me.
At night, friendly drones and missiles attacked the Vishkaima substation, 500 kilowatts, one of the key energy hubs of the Volga region. It has been put out of commission. This station is the most important node of the Middle Volga energy ring, which connects the power systems of the Urals and Central Russia. And it has been blown up. Strikes were carried out in the Moscow region at the airports of Nizhny Novgorod, Penza, Samara, Tambov, Sochi, Kaluga, Ulyanovsk, and Ufa. Air traffic was halted.
I already had a good cry. Stay in the envelope. Turn on your willpower. I can't hear anything.
Moscow is drowning in fire and chaos. Systems are collapsing like a house of cards. Russia is going into a tailspin. The authorities are losing control. Regions are flaring up one after another. A fuel crisis? It's only the beginning.
There were also several more strikes on stations and substations around Moscow. By the way, hardly anyone is talking about this. 4 substations around Moscow have already been knocked out. We've already reached that point.
Friends, good drones attacked the Vishkaima substation, which is one of the key energy hubs in the Volga region. It's completely out of commission. There are blackouts there. But the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed the strike on the Novokubishevsk oil refinery. And most importantly, it burned really spectacularly.
The strike
On the Orenburg gas processing plant in Russia. Holy shit, they really hit us hard. Oh, I don't want to be here. The Avangard defense plant in Bashkortostan was attacked. I think for the second time, 3 massive explosions, it's on fire. All of Russia is without gasoline. A fuel shortage has already been recorded in almost 90% of Russia's regions are affected. Amid drone attacks, Russian gas stations are being emptied, lines at the pumps are growing, and the no gasoline flash mob is spreading. 4 more regions have been added, specifically the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, Tuva, Udmurtia, and the Kurgan region. Let's discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, what do you think about the strikes? Well, first of all, of course, the Orenburg gas processing plant in Russia is burning fiercely. What do you think?
About half a year ago, sometime in the spring, around springtime, you and I were cursing our so-called great specialists with every swear word in the book for sending out drones in a scattershot way, just wherever. That went on until about August. Those almost random scattershot attacks didn't lead to anything. Why? Because if a sufficient number of drones are sent to a single point, then they can break through the frontline air defense. Let's say you need more than 100 in one spot, and then they reach the target area. So step by step, you have to take out 1 or 2 points at a time, maybe every day or 2, depending on how many drones you have. And for almost half a year, the drones were basically just being used up. That's how I would put it. Why? Because of the fan-shaped attacks with several drones sent in one direction, as if they were covering everything. But in the end, all the drones just got shut down. So there was an information flow. Yes, drones were flying somewhere, but there was absolutely no real effect from it. Now, most likely professionals have appeared. Professionals in the army, professionals in the headquarters, professionals making decisions about strikes on Russian rear positions, professionals, and you can already feel it. There are experts specifically in different sectors. The systematic destruction of Russia's oil industry is clearly understood. There is a certain sequence of actions in the strikes on the oil industry, and they are also tied to the redistribution and transfer of oil. In other words, the refineries that are currently important for the Russians to receive oil are being taken out, and they are being destroyed. Then the next one, whichever is needed, gets taken out next. We can already say that there is now a professional approach to the destruction, including of the gas processing sectors. For example, they hit that gas processing plant in Orenburg. It's not just a gas processing plant. It's a plant that operates in a single cycle with the helium plant. Hardly anyone talks about this. They just don't know. But it's true. There on the same site, the Orenburg gas processing plant and the helium plant are located side by side. The helium plant works directly for the Russian oil industry, receiving gas processing products from the gas plant. The most interesting thing is that the gas is supplied to Orenburg from Kazakhstan. There is a nearby Kazakh oil field which is being developed by an international consortium, so-called, which includes the Russian company Lukoil. Petroleum companies, well, all sorts of global players, as they're called, are simply pumping gas from the Kazakhs, and the Kazakhs only get 10% of it. So basically, they're stealing gas from the Kazakhs and pumping it to the Russian Orenburg gas processing plant. Then the money just goes into people's pockets. This is exactly how it works, by the way, at the Omsk oil refinery as well. The Russian one, that one a bit further away, about 1,500 kilometers further east, also takes oil from Kazakhstan, giving the Kazakhs mere pennies, basically. It's the exact same scheme, so to speak. And then the oil is processed at the Omsk oil refinery, which is the largest in Russia. 21 million tons processed per year. But to be fair, it's 3,000 kilometers for us to get there. He thinks we'll get there with the help of those same Kazakhs. In the end, the Kazakh people will realize that their gas and oil are simply being stolen from them. That's what it is. And then just shut down the Orenburg plant, shut down the Omsk plant. They're right there. And that's it. At least you'll be left with your oil and gas at the very least. No one will be stealing anymore. That's why these concerned people are helping us, including with the strikes on Orenburg. So we can see how this has been taken out of commission. At least one technological line has been shut down. Well, and that means they stopped the flow of gas from Kazakhstan to Russia. In other words, they solved the issue. Actually, they solved two issues at once. They reduced the amount of petrodollars, gas dollars, so to speak, in the Russian economy, and at the same time kept the gas for themselves, which they can later sell. Or at the very least, you get to work in Kazakhstan itself.
Already the audience, please like this video and write in the comments what you think about the work and armament of Ukraine. Our strikes, Roman Grigorievich, this is also very important, like the one on the Baku Bolshevik oil refinery. In the Samara region of Russia, explosions and a fire were reported at industrial facilities. The plant produces more than 20 types of commercial products, and its annual primary processing volume is 4.9 million tons. According to preliminary information, the primary oil processing units were hit. This is serious? What do you think?
Well, I once said oil a couple of times. Oil extraction. They told me, if you say it like that again, you won't get your bonus. You have to say oil extraction. So after that, I started correcting everyone. Say oil extraction, because otherwise the oil workers won't get their bonus at the very least. Well, that's an interesting approach. That's how they are about this oil extraction. Well, let it be that way. There have already been several strikes on the Novokuybishevsk plant. This is one of the main plants that produces, among other things, aviation kerosene for the Russians. Why is it that there are only about a dozen plants producing aviation kerosene in such quantities? And why is it so important for us to destroy precisely this type of plant? That's why I'm bringing this up now. Since August, they brought in professionals to the army specifically for target designation. They're destroying exactly what needs to be destroyed. Not just anything at random. It's exactly what needs to be targeted. That's why the sanctions of Malyuk and Budanov have now evolved into the sanctions of the professional Ukrainian army. Sanctions will fall, whether some like it or not. These are the kinds of sanctions imposed by the professional Ukrainian army, which are being applied to the Russian economy through the destruction of Russia's oil and gas sector. Novokuybishevsk is one of these kinds of plants. I believe it's located in the southwest of Samara, on the left bank. In other words, they reached it, completed the combat mission, and the technological production cycle has been halted. First of all, that's fuel production, and secondly, the supply of petrodollars to the Russian economy. So the destruction continues further of the Russian economy, which will eventually lead, just as it once led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the collapse of the Russian Federation. At last, this prison of nations will perish, though it's unlikely that God would accept it into his care.
Roman Ilyich, and now it seems we have some new updates. A figure has already emerged. 84% of Russia's regions are experiencing a fuel shortage. That's as of right now. Amid drone attacks, Russian gas stations are being emptied, lines at the pumps are growing, and prices are skyrocketing. And right now, all 4 regions of the terrorist federation have joined the no gasoline flash mob. Yamalonenets, Autonomous Okrug, Tuva, Udmurtia, and Kurgan Oblast. What do you say, Roman Grigorievich? To the
To the no gasoline flash mob, we should add another one: no brains among the Russian leadership. Yes, and the winner will be Moscow. Why? Because, well, or, like we once joked about the Rubliovka bathhouses. That's mostly where such decisions are made. Most likely it's because it's too cold in the Rubliovka bathhouses. They need to turn up the heat. Of course, ballistics would be better. I mean, ballistics raise the temperature quite well. I mean, really, who could have thought of attacking a country of 40 million people in the center of Europe? 600,000 square kilometers. There was just no brain at all. I mean, you'd have to be completely out of your mind to get into this adventure. This is a military adventure. I'm a military man. I just understand what it means to conduct military operations, their stages, their possibilities. And this is pure and simple, a military adventure. To capture a country of 40 million people, 600,000 square kilometers, is impossible even for a country that's, say, 5 times bigger, even if its resources are just as much. I mean, these are just unrealistic things. It can't be done. And the fact is, Putin now understands that he won't be able to capture all of Ukraine. He doesn't have enough strength, resources, or time. Even if there are 120 or 150 million people living there, he simply won't have enough time to accomplish this task. He's trying to bite off parts of it piece by piece. Because the initial approach from the very start was wrong. It was, when it comes to decision making, I'll say it again, from the perspective of any military person will tell you this. This is a military gamble that Putin pushed the Russian Federation into, and now it's facing the backlash, the blowback. Exactly the same kind of strikes that at one time the Russians carried out against Ukraine, destroying our oil industry, our oil refineries, our economy to some extent, but Europe supported us. Europe supported us, the democratic world, the G7, the G20, all of that is clear. In other words, we have serious support. The whole world is our rear, so to speak, while the Russians have no rear at all. The Chinese as a rear, well, they'll just take advantage of them, turn around and take advantage again. And as for the Indians, they'll make up, ask them for the Kama Sutra, and come up with even more creative positions regarding Russia. Not real help, but they'll make it look like help, and there's really no one else left to help them. So in reality, they have almost no rear, and as soon as we got involved, we gained one. A certain amount of strike assets is needed to do to Russian oil infrastructure what the Russians did to ours. Now this counterwave is coming, and now the Russians themselves are going to feel it on their own skin. What does real war actually mean? In reality, Ukraine only started truly fighting in August of 2025. We've only been truly fighting for 3 months, but this is war in its purest form. The enemy's rear areas are being destroyed. We've only just started targeting their rear. And so far, it's only the European part of the Russian Federation. We haven't even gone beyond the Urals yet. There was Operation Web. There were several strikes all the way to Gurovka, even to Vladivostok. They hit the fuel tanks there, most likely. They wanted to target the 115th Brigade. But in reality, we still haven't crossed beyond the Urals. There's still a lot of work to be done before we reach the Urals. That's why some western regions of Russia are now experiencing fuel shortages. They're already happening, and soon they'll reach Moscow as well. Most likely the eastern regions will experience shortages too. And there will definitely be problems since the distances are so vast. Cargo transport there relies mainly on fuel. So if they run out of fuel, it will be a real problem. That's exactly the kind of problem we need, and we'll be deliberately creating it. The purpose is to help the Russian Federation fall apart. 17 million square kilometers of territory without fuel. You can't get through. Just imagine how long it would take for someone to travel from Sakhalin to Moscow on a donkey, or rather for donkeys to make the trip on little donkeys. Yeah, they wouldn't make it even by the second coming from there. And halfway there, somewhere near Siberia, they'll give up, say, to hell with it, and head back to Sakhalin. By the way, the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, Zeleniklin, is not far from there, ours. Thank you. All these processes, in the end, what has started now will lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation, and the collapse of the state will lead to the collapse of the army. Why? Because the army is a derivative of the state. That's why we're moving in that direction. Little by little, step by step, slowly we'll come down from the mountain and take what's ours. All of this is the Russian herd. Before the Chinese even have time to take them from the east, we'll take them from the west. Dear
audience, just write some compliments about the humor. Roman Grigorievich, because that's truly a whole separate act in our broadcasts. Roman Grigorievich, a very interesting piece of news. The Russian substation Vishkaima 500 kilowatts was successfully attacked. And everyone is writing that this station is an important node in the power grid of the Middle Volga region, which connects the energy systems of the Urals and Central Russia. They say this is a big success. How do you assess this, Roman Grigorievich?
We have talked about this before, and we've already explained it to our listeners. There are several power supply systems. In Ukraine, it is the so-called grid system. What does that mean? It means that from generation, various levels of generation, from nuclear power plants, thermal power plants, hydroelectric power plants, and now also solar and wind power plants, power lines branch out and converge from several directions, like spokes on a wheel, you could say, to the main consumers. So basically, our consumers can be supplied from different directions. That's the kind of grid we have. Yes, on the one hand, it's difficult to maintain frequency or power there and to somehow balance it, but we have specialists for that. This system has been around since Soviet times, when Ukraine, precisely because there were so many technical and technological chains and industrial enterprises, was supplied with power. Take a mine, for example. Any mine is supplied from at least 3 different sources because people might be underground. So, of course, electric traction must always be available. It's the same situation with metallurgical plants. It's different in Russia. Here, because we have 600,000 square kilometers of territory, it's actually quite compact. But for the Russians, the problem is that their territory is stretched out. Moreover, there are several zones, at least about 7 or 8 zones of generation and 7 or 8 zones of consumption. And this peak, so-called, or rather the movement of this peak from east to west in terms of electricity consumption and generation too. They transfer electricity using stations like these, which are located between the zonal boundaries. Roughly speaking, electricity is generated in the Urals and consumed in Moscow. So there's only one station there that transfers electricity in one direction. Or when the peak shifts, let's say it moves to the west, then it starts again in the east, transferring in the other direction. So if these stations are knocked out, if the stations are taken out, the power supply system will be disrupted. And then, for example, in the Urals, the generated electricity will have nowhere to go, so they'll have to shut it down, while at the same time in Moscow, where that electricity is needed, it simply won't be available. They'll have to cut off an entire district. That's what happens when you strike stations like these. But that's the Russians' problem. They simply can't solve it because of the country's elongated shape. The territory is stretched out. And because of Russia's vast area, 17 million square kilometers. So we're taking advantage of that. That's why I say that now sanctions are being imposed on the Russians. The Ukrainian professional army, now real professionals, have joined in, including in the energy sector. There have also been several more strikes on stations and substations around Moscow. By the way, hardly anyone talks about this. 4 substations around Moscow. They've already been shut down. We've already reached that point. These are technological corridors, so-called energy corridors, that enter Moscow and bring electricity there. Directly, or for example, gas for thermal power plants, which are already balancing capacities, or oil and pipelines for gasoline and diesel. So there are 8 such corridors that go into Moscow. If you knock them out step by step in a circle around the ring outside of Moscow's air defense system, what did they do? They covered Moscow with air defense. It's impossible to get in there except with ballistic missiles, but these 8 corridors are located outside of Moscow's air defense zone. If you take them out, you can create the same kind of blackout as if you had just hit Moscow with ballistic missiles. That's exactly what our professional Ukrainian army is working on right now.
My God, Roman Nikolaevich, your music, your words, they are a song for my soul. Roman Nikolaevich, so what else are the armed forces of Ukraine and the general staff reporting? That we attacked, so the Moscow region, the Planka Aviable at the airports of Nizhny Novgorod, Penza, Samara, Tambov, Sochi, Kaluga, Ulyanovsk, and Ufa. Air traffic was halted. That's the geography of the strikes. What do you think?
Well, the suspension of air traffic is most likely due to, say, our drones or missiles flying along certain routes. In other words, therefore, closing airspace is actually a truly critically important and necessary measure to prevent any potential unforeseen emergency situations within the airspace. In other words, it's better not to let a plane take off or land than to have to figure out what point it was, what kind of so-called UFO it was, and which missile tried to shoot it down. Everyone still remembers Azerbaijan. May those who died there rest in peace, the guys and girls. I mean, the people who were on that Azerbaijani flight that was shot down by a Russian missile. So to avoid being hit like that, for example, the Azerbaijani plane was hit and they don't want their own to be hit. Naturally, they announce a planned cover as soon as there is any overflight by some unidentified flying object, and the air defense systems are activated, switched to combat mode. And some of those systems are launched automatically. In other words, they shoot down everything that moves in the air, as they say. So from that point of view, such actions are justified. Naturally, this simply shows the geography of the flights of our drones or strike assets, and they also activate missiles. So it's quite a serious geographic range. Roughly from Rostov to Ufa, that's over 1,000 kilometers. And naturally from the south, from Rostov to Ulyanovsk as well, or rather to Moscow and further north. That's another 1,000 kilometers. So right now we're covering a pretty large area. Mainly we're currently targeting Russian energy infrastructure. These 8 corridors I mentioned: oil, the Russian gas sector, petrochemicals, and remember my words, metallurgy is next for Russia. And why shouldn't we forget about metallurgy? It's another industry that brings a lot of foreign currency into the Russian treasury. That's why metallurgy definitely needs to be targeted, especially metallurgy. A metallurgical plant is very easy to shut down. Every metallurgical plant has an oxygen workshop. By the way, this isn't just a task for our drones, it's a task for all those who care. If you take out the oxygen workshop, it explodes from practically any aerial bomb, from any spark, really. If the oxygen workshop is shut down at a metallurgical plant, the whole plant stops. So with this kind of mechanism, you can put additional pressure on the Russian economy.
Roman Nikolaevich, there have also been videos appearing of explosions at the Avangard defense plant in Bashkortostan. It seems to me that we already talked about attacking this defense plant, but as I understand it, this was a repeat attack. According to updated data from the Russians, buildings were attacked, there was an explosion at the facility, and they write that it was a drone attack. Avangard is located in the city of Sterlitamak. It is part of the Russian state corporation Rostec. The enterprise produces industrial explosives and is also involved in the disposal of weapons and military equipment. What do you think?
They produce rockets. By rockets, I mean unguided ones. At that level, of course, they also make rocket fuel and explosives. This is important for us. It was important to hit them again. The explosion was good. If you show the footage, it's available in the information stream. In other words, we hit exactly where we needed to, and the range was over 1,000 kilometers. So we reached them. As we discussed before, remember, Malyuk probably didn't work things out with some Bashkir woman. So now, again, it's like trying to win her back. But now, of course, it's not just the security service. This is truly the work of our professional Ukrainian army. Right now, it's the Ukrainian Defense Forces at work, and they're fully engaged. All the special services have already joined in. All the mechanisms of the armed forces of Ukraine and the special services, including the main intelligence directorate, the security service, the foreign intelligence service, as well as the drone units, special operations forces, the air fleet, that is our air forces, and the Navy, are all at work. In other words, our entire security apparatus has now finally started to focus specifically on the enemy's rear areas. And this is having a very significant effect, starting with the disruption of the Russian economy, which, as we discussed before, will be an issue next year. Remember, we talked about Nabiullina, just not in that direction. Nabiullina is Tatar, not Bashkir. Just a little note for understanding. So it's a bit different than that. Specifically regarding Tatarstan, actually the GUR is mainly operating in Tatarstan. That's Budanov's people. Most likely they don't want to step on each other's toes. So they're working in Tatarstan, and right next door in Bashkortostan, the security service is already at work. That's why Nabiullina will definitely be in trouble next year, because she won't be able to handle this situation if no one stops it. This is very important here. They've already had to start over twice. Last year they started off well, but stopped in May. This year they started off well, but stopped in March. Now they've started again in August finally, and it's already the 3rd month. Well, if things keep going like this and no one stops it, then the Russian economy is in for real trouble next year.
God willing. Roman Igorovich, Business Insider, has reported that cheap Ukrainian interceptor drones are changing the rules of war and are becoming a key element of defense. According to Admiral Pierre Vandy, Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, strike-type interceptor drones are among the most promising means of defense against Russian attacks. During one of the recent massive barrages, they shot down more than 150 drones. Ukraine is aiming to ramp up production to 1,000 such interceptors per day. Your analysis is particularly interesting here, Roman Grigorievich.
Well, this isn't a panacea. Let's approach this from the perspective of real-world facts. At the moment, yes, there is the capability to intercept Russian drones with internal combustion engines. They are low speed, fly at low altitudes, and have limited maneuverability. In that case, yes, theoretically, you can intercept them with a drone. But again, that's only about a quarter of the total traffic, no more than that, because they can still fly at higher altitudes, well, relatively higher at least, or at extremely low altitudes, making it impossible, for example, to engage that drone. That's why this is one of the mechanisms for countering Russian drones. If we really want to take a realistic approach and look to the future, we absolutely need to think strategically in this regard. Understanding that Russian Gerans, Russian Chinese Gerans will move away from internal combustion engines and switch to turbines, so-called. In other words, they've already started installing them. The Geran 3 is already a jet-powered drone, you could say. It's equipped with a turbine. An engine that allows this drone to accelerate to speeds over 500 kilometers per hour and reach altitudes above 5,000 meters. And at that point, an interceptor drone won't be able to catch up with it. First of all, it won't catch up to it. And second, it won't be able to reach it in terms of altitude. So we need to look ahead and understand that the optimal solution at the moment is to use anti-aircraft missile systems with very inexpensive missiles. We need to look into how best to guide them. In other words, to do it optimally. Now we're starting to receive tiles, by the way, the missiles that are just starting to arrive. It's a very good solution. They found the right way to use some unguided rockets. For example, the NAR is an unguided aircraft rocket, also known as something like the Hydra. This is a 70 millimeter rocket into which between the booster section and the warhead, a guidance system is inserted. And this guidance system allows the rocket to hit the target with almost 100% accuracy using reflected laser targeting. In other words, it's a so-called laser pointer. A laser beam illuminates the target, and then this rocket can home in on any target, even the most interesting ones. It's not just for Geran drones. It could also be used for cruise missiles. In principle, any reflective surface can be targeted, and this rocket can accomplish its mission against it. Moreover, it can be used against drones, cruise missiles, helicopters, airplanes, and it can also be used against ground targets with this laser pointer. For example, if a target is illuminated, it can also strike ground targets, such as a tank or a fortified position. That's why most likely the future really lies with these kinds of mechanisms. If we're talking about strategy, it should be a missile that is multifunctional and capable of carrying out such tasks. The only thing is, it needs to be inexpensive. Here is one of the options for cheap missiles, cheaper than the Russian Geran with a turbocharged engine. And this is exactly what will most likely allow us to fully cover the front line from aerial targets at the very least. Of course, it won't be able to reach ballistic targets, but it can protect against aerial threats. But until all this happens, it will take time. This requires a large number of air defense systems and a large number of modified missiles. This process needs to be started. In the meantime, interceptor drones will definitely be needed, as well as light aircraft, which we've discussed for several years now. We've been talking about light aircraft that will finish off whatever makes it past the front line. So these missiles are better used in so-called frontal air defense. There, they will also be able to operate against ground targets later on, and whatever manages to get past the front line somehow slips through. Here, you can use interceptor drones, light aircraft, helicopters, and fighter jets. Plus, there are medium and long-range surface-to-air missile systems, which can also perform this kind of task. That's why it's necessary to build a multi-layered zonal defense system right from the start. That's what air defense is about. That's what we're discussing with you right now.
Roman Igorovich, an interesting piece of news just came in from Poland. A subterranean tunnel was discovered at the border in Poland. The tunnel started on the Belarusian side and ended about 20 meters from the fence on the Polish side. Polish border guards in the Podlaski voivodeship found this tunnel, which had been dug several dozen meters under the fence at the Poland-Belarus border. This was announced by Poland's Minister of Internal Affairs, Marcin Kierwiński, and everyone is discussing that. First and foremost, this was not done by migrants for illegal migration. Most likely, this is a sabotage operation by Russian or Russian-Belarusian military forces. And your opinion is interesting here, because the Polish publication Anet noted that this is not the first time such a tunnel has been discovered at the border. In September, illegal migrants tried to cross the border from Belarus into Poland in this way, but many believe that it wasn't migrants and most likely it was sabotage by Russia. What do you think?
Well, unless it was Lukashenko himself, who dug the tunnel to sell potatoes at Polish markets then. Maybe it is sabotage, although that's unlikely. The thing is, tunnels of this kind are practically everywhere, at all borders. I mean, people dig them, they dig along the border fortifications. The optimal way to get through something closed off is to try to tunnel under it. Or there are certain zones before the border, not the border itself, but specific areas you have to cross before reaching the border, and these are guarded by border guards, let's say, on their side, but then people tunnel underneath them and come out right at the border itself. That's the kind of tunnels they make. We had quite a few of those too back in the day, and it wasn't just tunnels. Sometimes people would lay pipes underground to pump gasoline or diesel, basically to smuggle fuel across. So in principle, well, that's just too trivial an action to think it was done deliberately, say, by the FSB guys. The FSB guys aren't going to be digging. Just imagine they get out of their G-Wagons and start digging somewhere, like let's dig here or there. They're not going to do that. I mean, if they need to get something done, they handle it differently. So I think this is just something trivial, maybe related to transporting, say, illegal immigrants. I wouldn't rule out that possibility. Just look at the US-Mexico border. It's all dug up along its length and everywhere. So here we're definitely not going to look for some big hidden agenda. Well, the only thing I'll repeat, if Lukashenko had enough surplus, he'd just send his produce to the Polish markets, where it's a bit more expensive.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, I'd like us to reflect together about the interview with Volodymyr Zelensky, which he gave to journalists after his visit to Washington. In short, the front air defense, Tomahawks. The situation in the Kupiansk direction has improved. In Pokrovsky, it's difficult but stable. In Novopavlivka, fighting continues for 3 liberated villages, and in the Sumy region, things have gotten better. Ukraine and the US are preparing a contract to purchase 25 Patriot systems. Trump did not transfer Tomahawk missiles in order to avoid escalation with Russia. Budapest and its territories are not the best place for a meeting. Russia has not changed its position, demanding that Ukraine completely withdraw from Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukraine's position remains unchanged. There will be no withdrawal from Donbass. The issue remains unresolved. From our negotiations, it is clear that if Ukraine accepts what has been put on its plate, that is a bad territorial solution, then they will try to resolve everything else without us. And then there's the sale of drones. The US and Ukraine and America is interested in an agreement on the sale of US drones. Zelensky emphasized that such systems are important for the future wars of the United States. And we have agreements with Slovakia on gas imports. Russia and Europe have lost to the Americans. There are 3 major energy projects between the US and Ukraine. Everything will be wonderful. The development of LNG terminals potentially in Odessa. Roman Grigorievich, what do you think?
There are no Mogovkovs there.
No.
It's going in circles. It's consistently bad. Well, not bad for me, but consistently it's not stable there. There's a serious problem now, and this is exactly the surrender of Donbass. You don't have to talk about it. You can just do it. What we've been seeing lately is exactly the surrender of Donbass. The Russians have already captured almost 4/5 of Donbass. We have a 1/5, maybe a little more left that we control, but it's an important 1/5. Why? Because it's the so-called third line of defense, which holds the Russians back from advancing toward the Dnipro River. This refers to the Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Poltava regions, among others. So this third line needs to be held from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk. And we, and in Kupiansk, are facing quite serious difficulties. That's why on the front line now, and the Russians have launched the second wave, which we've been talking about for the past 6 months. Now it's here, and the equipment has started moving in as well. They're trying to break through because there are problems here that need to be solved. And under no circumstances can we let the Russians through. If they reach open ground, we could lose the left bank Ukraine, and that would be very bad. That would be irrecoverable, at least for the next few years, if not decades. And Donbass at the moment, it's like a bone in the Russians' throat. Even the remaining territory, the third line of defense, is like a bone in the Russians' throat. Why do they want to either pull it out or swallow it somehow? Why are there such requests? Basically, they're saying, just withdraw yourselves. In other words, under no circumstances should this be done, just as the fighting must not be stopped. This also needs to be clearly understood. Any halt in hostilities will give the enemy an operational pause to build up forces, resources, and continue advancing. What, is this our first year at this? We've been at this since 2014. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, we've already digested them and flushed them down the toilet. So this issue needs to be closely monitored and forgotten about. For any topics related to agreements with the Russians, what agreements? Especially since they are on our territory. Even any contact with the enemy, if they're on your territory, is capitulation. You must never agree to capitulation under any circumstances. Otherwise, that's exactly what happens. It would be like handing over part of Ukraine on a silver platter. They'll just take another bite later. Not just the platter, they'll take your hand, your head, they'll devour everything. So I don't care what Budapest you're talking about, you can't make contact. Not in Budapest or anywhere else for that matter. You can't make contact. Trump just wants to hug it out with Putin again. But that's their problem. Give them a copy of the Kama Sutra. Let them finally sort out all these issues in a technically competent way. 1 minute they're together, the next they're apart. They just can't seem to measure each other up. So in this sense, it's better for us to treat Trump like a smell. Step away and you don't smell it. So how should you treat a smell? Just step away and you don't smell it. Simple as that. That's how we should treat Trump, because right now he reeks of Russian spirit, as they call it. There's no point in pulling him somewhere or stirring things up. The best option is to work through Europe. For example, contracts for the supply of Patriots, a good Patriot vehicle, an excellent American machine. It fully accomplishes its tasks. And honestly, 25 Patriots would definitely not hurt us. Big money. This needs to be coordinated with the Europeans. Basically, it's best to get everything through them. Although, again, we shouldn't just settle for the Patriot. There's also the SMT, and there are also anti-ballistic systems. The optimal option is to ensure our country's security from Russian ballistic missiles and to have our own ballistic missiles that can reach the Rubliovka Dakhas. That's the most important thing. In other words, we need to have our own ballistic missiles that can cover Moscow, and Moscow can only be hit with ballistic missiles. And when we have the capability to deliver reciprocal strikes on the Russian capital, then just like that for us, after that, we won't even need Patriots anymore. So it's better to spend the money earmarked for Patriots at this point on producing our own ballistic missiles. It's 500 kilometers to Moscow. Figure it out, set up the production line, and tackle these kinds of tasks. Dear
audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan, we discuss current military and political events 3 times a week. Roman Grigorievich, I am very grateful to you.
Goodbye.